Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about what really ruffles the American colonists' feathers and forces them, essentially, to declare their independence from Mother England. And it's going to be a series of taxes and perceived slights on that they feel that England has given towards them that are going to make them suddenly begin to feel like independence is their only recourse to be able to have full autonomy and be able to say and do as they please. And so for today, you need to have in your notes Causes of the American Revolution, Part 1. We will have another video on this in your next one that we'll look at tomorrow, but this is the first half of it. So, if you remember, we talked about from the French and Indian War video that throughout the years there had been kind of colonial clashes, and that Britain had been fighting the French and the Indians for years. There had been things like King William's War and Queen Anne's War and King George's War. They're all real original names, right? And one of the things that comes out of all of these clashes is something known as the Albany Congress, or the Albany Plan of Union in 1754. And it was proposed by that guy over there, Benjamin Franklin. And the idea is it wants to create kind of a loose confederation, that the colonies before had kind of almost been like separate little groups. They hadn't ever really been together. And for the first time, he kind of wants to bring them together, not as a country necessarily, but wants them to work together and talk with one another and learn to kind of work through issues and problems, and focused on things like defense, on how they were going to better defend their colonies. Now, the French and Indian War had happened, and if you remember from our last video, it was mainly a battle over a control for North America, which meant land, and the fur trade. And so after the French and Indian War, the kind of shape and size of North America really changes. For the first time in 50 years, England was at peace. They weren't fighting a war. But as a result of all that fighting, they'd accumulated a massive war debt. And so one of the ways that they kind of logically see that they need to raise money is to tax the colonies, because they see the French and Indian War as a war not against just the British and the Native Americans, or the French and the Native Americans. They see it as a war that was to help preserve the colonies, and so it was fought on the colonies' behalf. Therefore, logically for them, the colonists should have to pay for it, and that means raising taxes on them. If you remember, we talked a little bit last time about the Proclamation of 1763, and it really angers the colonists to a degree for two reasons. One, it will raise taxes on them, which we'll talk about in a minute, but two, it restricts where they can and can't go. And so on the map here, if you look, there's the dark pink area. That had been the traditional boundaries for colonies. That's where people had lived for decades and before the French and Indian War. If you remember, people had been starting to move out of these areas and move into what is current day Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, parts of even Tennessee, and had been coming into contact with the French and the Native Americans and been coming into skirmishes with them. And so the British are going to say with this proclamation of 1763, no more. Do not move past the Appalachian Mountains. That all this does is create chaos. We want to have kind of a buffer zone between the Native Americans and the few French that are there and us. And so stop doing this. And if you're a Native American, if you're Indians, you love this new line. You like this idea because you hope that it kind of is going to preserve your homeland, your territory. Now, the results of the Proclamation of 1763, well, it largely fails and has minimal effect on the colonial expansion. Most colonists just say, yeah, whatever, what are you gonna do about it, Britain? You're all the way over there on an island by yourself on the other side of the world. You can't really enforce this, so we're just gonna kind of do whatever we want to do. And they do. They move off into these territories. They can continue to claim land, and it really wasn't policed by the British. They didn't really know what to do and how to stop them. But remember, one of the things that is popular, or that does work, is the taxation part of the proclamation. And one of those taxes is the Sugar Act of 1764. It taxes molasses and sugar, and the idea is that, again, that tax is going to go to help pay off those war debts that the British had accrued because of the French and Indian War. You also get the Stamp Act, and this is quite possibly one of the most influential and important acts of all of the pre-Revolutionary War taxation. And in 1765, the British say, from now on, if you have a piece of paper, essentially, you have to have a stamp on it. Not to the same thing as we think of like today, like a postage stamp, but really like a stamp on it that would be embedded into the paper that would show that you had paid a tax on that piece of paper. Everything from newspapers to pamphlets to books, licenses, legal documents, even playing cards had a stamp on it. And that means it's going to raise the cost of these pieces of paper, and it's going to anger the colonists very much. So much so that in Massachusetts, in Boston, for example, in 1765, you have a group of people who get together who call themselves the Sons of Liberty. They see these taxes as unjust, that they weren't really able to vote on these as British citizens, because remember, the colonists see themselves as British citizens. They don't see themselves as colonists or as somebody else. They see themselves as British citizens, and so they're going to see these taxes as unfair. And this group, in protest of the new taxes, began to kind of go out and attack the stamp agents, the guys whose job it was to make sure you had stamps and on your pieces of paper. And they also end up destroying the lieutenant governor's house. And so, if you can kind of think of it, to some degree, they're almost like terrorists. They're kind of out like roaming the countryside, taking over places and causing fear in a lot of these workers for the British Crown. One of the biggest ones also is the Townsend Act of 1767. Now, these are multiple ones, and the only act that really is the most important is the Quartering Act of 1765. And this act really enrages many colonists because it requires the colonists for the first time to house British soldiers in your home. If a British soldier comes to your house and knocks on the door and says, "I need a place to sleep tonight," you have to let them come in and stay with you. And you not only have to do that, you have to wash and press their uniform. You have to feed them if they need be. You have to give them any other supplies that you had. If you are a colonist who's barely hanging on by a thread for survival, and suddenly now you end up having to take care of British soldiers, it's going to anger you. You also have the Townsend duties, which means there was more taxes on imports from Great Britain. Things like lead, paint, paper, tea, they all have greater taxes, which means it's going to be more money coming out of your pocket. And remember, if you're not making very much money to begin with, it's going to be even harder for you to survive having to pay these extra taxes. Now, the response, well, for the colonists, they come up with the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," meaning that they had no legal representation in Parliament. Parliament being that legislative body in Great Britain, they had nobody sitting in Parliament who could actually vote for these things. So they had no voice, they felt. And for years, they had felt that England had followed a policy of what was known as salutary neglect, which basically meant as long as the colonists weren't getting in our way, we're just going to kind of let them do whatever they want. And so the colonists really had run their country, that run the colonies how they saw fit. They taxed when they wanted to tax. They fought wars when they wanted to fight wars. They did what they wanted to. And suddenly now, after the French and Indian Wars, England's getting involved for the first time, and it's really angering the colonists. The British policy had lasted up and through 1763, and they hadn't really forced any laws. They're going to start doing that, and it's going to anger people very much. All of this starts to come to boil up and come to a head in Boston. The colonists the British end up seizing ships and taking over things that they think are being illegally smuggled. Violence in Boston and protests to the taxes and the seizure of ships lead to boycotting of British goods, and the British troops end up occupying the city and really locking down what the British or what the Boston citizens can and can't do. The Townsend dies, and his replacement repeals all of his duties, but by that point, people are angry, and Boston themselves becomes a martyr colony. People begin to see Massachusetts as kind of the first victim of this British tyranny against the American colonies. And so, for a lot of people, Massachusetts is going to be kind of the standard bearer, the people that they look to follow on what to do about dealing with Mother England and this perceived slight of no taxation without representation. So, before you're done today, make sure you answer these 3 questions at the bottom of your notes in complete sentences. 1. What items were taxed by the Stamp Act of 1765? Number 2, how did the policy of salutary neglect help lead the colonists towards revolution? And number 3, explain in your own words what no taxation without representation means. Have those at the bottom of your page. If you have any other questions, also make sure you have those at the bottom. We will talk about them more tomorrow in class. And that's about it. So just understand that all of this is starting to create tension and frustration and anger, and it's going to lead to people to feel like they have to do something drastic, which means breaking away from Mother England. Until next time, have a great rest of your day. Bye.